You're listening to a podcast from the BBC World Service. This is Hardtalk with me, Stephen Sacker. Thanks for downloading this edition of the programme. I do hope you enjoy it. My guest today has swapped life as a politician in one of Europe's wealthiest, most stable countries for a stint as the figurehead leader of NATO, the Western world's military alliance. Few predicted that JensStoltenberg, former Prime Minister of Norway, would make the leap to NATO. After all, he has no military experience and he's never even served as a defence minister. His appointment was a low-key affair which made few ripples. But now he faces big challenges. NATO lost its clear sense of purpose when the Cold War came to an end. There followed a host of out-of-area military engagements from Afghanistan to Libya, which raised questions about the coherence and relevance of the Western alliance. Now the wheel has turned again. Vladimir Putin's determination to project Moscow's power in former Soviet territories, first Georgia, now Ukraine, has prompted NATO to put a new emphasis on securing its eastern flank. The US wants Europe to show it's serious about burden sharing by spending much more on defence. But the most insidious threats to Western security are no longer from conventional armies. They require a new mindset from politicians and military leaders. So, is NATO capable of responding? Well, JensStoltenberg joins me now. Welcome to Hardtalk.
Thank you so much.
Let me begin with a question of basic strategic doctrine. Does NATO see Russia as a threat today?
We see a Russia which is more assertive and which is responsible for aggressive actions in Ukraine and which has invested heavily in defense over a long period of time. And that's the reason why NATO is adapting. We are increasing the readiness of our forces. We are increasing our military presence in the eastern part of the alliance, and we're also establishing new small headquarters in 6 Eastern European or Eastern allied countries. And all of this is a response to a more assertive Russia.
Right, but I would love a direct answer to the question. A more assertive Russia, that's a phrase. It doesn't really mean very much. But if you tell the people who live in the NATO countries that Russia is a strategic threat, that means something. So are you now prepared to say it?
I'm prepared to say exactly what I'm saying, and that is that we see a changed security environment, both to the east with a more assertive Russia willing to use force to change borders.
But to challenge NATO, that's the point.
And also challenges coming from the south, with ISIL, with turmoil, violence taking place in Iraq, Syria, North Africa, and all of this creates a new and more demanding security environment, and NATO has to respond and to adapt, and that's exactly what we are doing.
And I hope in the course of this interview we'll talk about both different theatres of operation, but let's stick with Russia for just a little while. NATO's taking some decisions. You know, you talk about your rapid response force. I think there are 30,000 troops that can be sent very quickly to the eastern flank. There are 5,000 who are part of a new spearhead force. Do you accept that the message you are sending to Moscow is bound to ratchet up the tensions between you and Putin?
What we do is a response to the aggressive actions we have seen by Russia in Ukraine. What we do is defensive, it's proportionate, and it's something we do to make sure that NATO remains a strong alliance which is able to protect and defend all allies against any threat. And there is no reason to call that provocative, because what we do is actually very defensive and very proportionate to the new security environment which surrounds us.
Before we get to Ukraine itself, would you say that Russia's wider military actions in the region are, to use your word, provocative? We see exercises repeatedly on close to NATO's border. We see the Russians talking about putting new weapon systems, very sophisticated ones, into Kaliningrad, of course, on Poland's doorstep. We see nuclear-capable bombers flying many more routes over Europe and around the world. Would you call these provocations?
I will call them part of a pattern where we see that Russia in many ways are challenging the security order we have strived to establish after the end of the Cold War, which was a partnership with Russia, and that doesn't exist anymore because Russia is both investing heavily in defense. They are doing all these SNAP exercises, reducing predictability, transparency related to their military activities, and in addition to that they are using nuclear rhetoric as part of their defense posture. And all of this creates a challenge to us, and we are responding the way we are doing. But we don't seek any confrontation with Russia. We continue to strive for a more cooperative and constructive relationship with Russia. And for me, it's very important to underline that there is no contradiction between strong defense and political dialogue. Actually, I believe that we need strong defense to have the foundation for a political dialogue with Russia.
Let's talk specifically about Ukraine. In the last week, we've seen new fighting on that eastern front in Ukraine. The Ukrainians report that in one heavy artillery barrage by the rebel forces, 8 Ukrainian soldiers were killed. Clearly looks like a direct violation of the Minsk agreement. President Poroshenko uses these cases to say NATO members, this is a quote from him, NATO members should provide us with weapons so we can protect ourselves and resist this aggression. Do you agree with him?
NATO provides strong both political and practical support to Ukraine. We support their sovereignty, their territorial integrity. We support full implementation of the Minsk agreements. But we also provide practical support. We have established trust funds. We work with them on cyber, on logistics, on command and control, and several NATO allies also help them with training, advice, and so on. So in total, we provide strong political and strong practical
That's
support.
not the way he, President Poroshenko, or the Ukrainians see it. They specifically and repeatedly ask for military support. They want arms and weapons supplies. Are you prepared to give them?
So NATO does not possess military equipment, so we are not in a position where we can provide equipment.
Your 28 members could provide significant military equipment. I think at least one, Lithuania, has said that they will do so. I believe they are doing so. There is no unified position, but if you, as Secretary General of NATO, were to make clear your personal position, that might make a difference. So what is your personal position?
We provide practical support to Ukraine, but I think the most important thing now is to do whatever we can to support the full implementation of the Minsk agreements.
But you know it's not being recognized, it's being violated,
but
so
still,
then what do you do?
But still the Minsk agreements is the best possible way to peace, is the path to peace in Ukraine, and therefore we see violations. We see that the heavy weapons are not removed from the contact line as agreed in the Minsk agreements. But we will continue to support the implementation and also continue to call for full access of the international observers to the region so they can make sure that they can inspect and monitor the implementation of the Minsk agreements.
Does it trouble you that NATO members are clearly deeply divided on the question of what to do now about Putin and about Russia's activities in Ukraine?
NATO is actually very unified in its response, and we have decided, and we are in the process of implementing the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense since the end of the Cold War. And I'm actually impressed about how much we have been able to do during a very short period of time, doubling the size of our NATO response force, increasing the military presence in the eastern part of the alliance, and establishing new headquarters in the eastern allied countries.
Well, I use the word divided because I look at the reality on the ground. I look at the words coming from leaders of East European member states of NATO who clearly do want to arm the Ukrainians and help them in a very active way against the Russians. Then we compare that with what we hear from the Germans, for example, or the Italians, who are adamant that there can be none of that sort of involvement in the Ukrainian crisis. You look at the opinion polls. Fascinating one from Pew Research Center finds that in France, Italy and Germany, a majority of people do not support the use of force even to defend an ally from an attack by Russia. So there are divisions inside the NATO membership.
NATO is an alliance of 28 democratic societies, and there will always be different opinions, different views and discussions. For me, that's not a weakness, it is a strength, because in open democratic societies there are different views. As long as we are able to conclude the discussions and to make decisions and to implement them, then discussions, different opinions is not a weakness, it's a strength. And that's exactly what we have been able to do.
But let's consider where the strength really lies in this standoff with Moscow. Over the last, let's say, decade, look at the reality on the ground. You know, Putin has, in effect, sent a message to NATO in Georgia first, where Russian troops went into the enclaves, and actually the enclaves still remain under Russian control to all intents and purposes. He sent another message in Ukraine, and today we see Ukraine deeply divided. And the likelihood is that Georgia, Ukraine, you could add Moldova as well, are going to be frozen conflicts under the influence of Moscow for the long term. So you say we want a constructive dialogue with Moscow, and at the same time Moscow calls the shots. You are allowing Putin to shape the future of that region.
Our main responsibility, our core task, is to protect all allies, and that's exactly what we are doing by reinforcing our collective defense. And we are also providing support for Georgia, for Moldova, and for Ukraine. They are not NATO members, but they are partners of NATO. We have a substantial cooperation with Georgia. We are doing exercises with them. We are supporting and helping them. We help Ukraine with modernizing and reforming their armed forces. And we have just decided to also start with defense capacity building, as we call it, in Moldova with the Moldovan government. So there is no easy way, there is no quick fix, but we will continue to work with our partners east of the alliance to help them being able to protect themselves, to protect their sovereignty and territorial integrity.
It's staggering, is it not, that in this new climate of tension with Moscow, and a very real sense that NATO's eastern flank is under pressure, it's staggering that the absolute value of defence expenditure amongst all NATO members is actually declining rather than rising.
Defense expenditures in NATO countries has declined over a long period of time, partly because after the end of the Cold War, I think many NATO allies thought it was wise to reduce defense spending.
No, but my point is it's still going down, even though there is now perceived to be a real threat from Russia.
That's true. I'm just trying to put this into context, because for many years defense spending was going down because of the end of the Cold War. And I was Minister of Finance back in Norway, and I was responsible for reducing defense expenditures in Norway in the 1990s. But then, exactly as you are stating, now tensions are increasing again, and now we have to be able to increase defense spending again. And that's the reason why we decided at our summit last fall to stop the cuts and then gradually increase defense spending and move towards spending 2% within a decade.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you've looked recently at what the Spanish are doing, the Canadians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians. I mean, they're struggling to get to 1% of GDP. You know, you can talk forever about how there is now a new commitment to get to this 2% spending threshold, but the member states, many of them, are simply not prepared to do it. And the Americans say, if you Europeans aren't serious, we're going to have to forget about NATO.
So I have studied the defense expenditures and statistics in different NATO allies very carefully, and I see that the picture is very mixed. Some countries are on a very low level, others have started to increase. This year we expect 18 allies to have a real increase in defense expenditures. That's not enough, but it's a good start. We have a country like the United Kingdom, UK, and I welcome very much the announcement that the UK will have a real increase in defense expenditures for the next 5 years, and the very strong commitment to remain above the 2% guideline. So this is leadership. This is something which is important for the whole alliance, and it proves that it is possible to increase defense spending and to also meet the 2% guideline.
You pointed out to me early in this interview that NATO has to consider a new level of threat, not just in the east, but also in the south. So let's talk about that a little bit. What usefully can NATO contribute to the fight against so-called Islamic State?
All NATO allies contribute to the US-led coalition fighting ISIL, and very much of the interoperability, the capability to work together, which we have developed in the NATO framework, is now very useful now in this coalition, also with partner nations of NATO, which we, for instance, work together with in Afghanistan. In addition to contributing to the international coalition fighting ISIL, NATO is also doing more and more to try to project stability without always deploying large number of combat forces. That is, for instance, what we now do in Afghanistan.
It's a very interesting phrase, project stability. I don't know if that's what you thought you were doing in Libya, but isn't the truth that having undertaken quite a number of out-of-area operations in the recent past, NATO got very stung by the very negative results, not least in Libya. The lesson learned, surely, is that NATO really has nothing to offer in terms of military intervention. Libya suggests that, frankly, it's counterproductive.
I think it's important to be honest about that. When to use military force and when to not use military force is one of the most difficult decisions politicians have to make.
And would you accept Libya was a disaster in the long run? Because it's now become a training ground for ISIL.
NATO did what we set out to do, and that was to implement the UN mandate to stop the killings of civilians. The problem was to follow up after the end of the military operations, the lack of efforts to stabilize the country. But for instance, NATO's first big operation was in the Balkans, in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in Kosovo. And I will call that a successful military operation. We contributed to ending the wars. We have contributed to stabilizing the whole region. And there are problems, there are challenges in the Western Balkans today. But without the big NATO military operations there, I think the situation would have been much worse than it is today.
Well,
the same in Afghanistan. Yeah. Without NATO operating there, I think that Afghanistan would have still been a safe haven for international terrorists.
Right, and stability isn't just about the threat of terrorism. There's also, as many countries in Europe are now very well aware, a big challenge from immigration, which could, of course, be combined with security if some of the immigrants who are coming in are a potential terror threat. The problem is, one of the countries on the front line in terms of the security of Europe is Greece. Greece right now is in meltdown, and 80,000 migrants have come through Greece this year. Can NATO do anything about that, given that Greece is a stalwart member of NATO?
So Greece is a very committed NATO ally, and they have stated very clearly that even if they have now big challenges related to the debt crisis, the agreement with the European Union and so on, they will continue and remain a staunch and committed ally, and I welcome that.
Well, forgive me, but the Greek defense minister back in the spring said, if Europe leaves us in crisis, we will flood it with migrants. It'll be even worse for Berlin if, in that wave of millions of economic migrants, there might be some jihadists of the Islamic State too. That was Greece's defense minister.
But they have reached an agreement, and I think we can welcome that for many reasons. I think it's good for Greece, I think it's good for Europe, but it's of course also good for all of us and for the stability in Europe.
You talk about welcoming agreements. There's another agreement that I just wonder whether you've had a strong opinion about in the last few days. That is the agreement struck between the so-called Permanent 5+1 group and Iran over the future of Iran's nuclear program. You know very well that there are conservatives in the United States and certainly the Israeli government describing this deal as a huge and historic mistake which will give Iran a pathway to a nuclear weapon but also open up huge economic advantage to the Islamic Republic of Iran. Do you, as NATO Secretary General, feel entirely confident this is a good deal?
I welcome the deal, and I think that the deal is important because the alternative would have been to just continue to watch a development in Iran where they were moving more and more close to having a nuclear bomb or a nuclear weapon. And so I think that this deal is the best possible tool we have to to avoid Iran developing nuclear weapons, and that's important for all of us and all NATO allies.
I suppose one lesson of how that deal was done over years was that it was a collective effort by a group that came together for a specific diplomatic challenge. In a way, it does beg this question. Maybe NATO's outlived its usefulness because you can only act when all 28 member states are unanimously behind a policy. That is extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Maybe it's time to accept that these ad hoc, multilateral, cooperative groupings can achieve more than a very weighty institution like NATO.
So NATO is the answer to many problems, but not the only answer to all problems. And our main responsibility is to provide security for our member states. And we are doing that by being a very strong deterrent. And the success of NATO shall be measured on the results. And the most important result we have achieved is that we have been able for more than 6 decades to make sure that there has been no attack on any ally for all these years. And we will continue to provide that strong defense of all allies.
Mutual defence pact, that's what you are. But that isn't altogether straightforward, is it? And I bring it back to Russia, which we talked about earlier. Russia has clearly undertaken some challenging actions against member states. For example, against Estonia, where there was an incident at a border which involved, I think, the capture of a particular individual on Estonian territory, ended up back inside Russia. Also, accusations that Russia conducted a serious cyber attack against Estonia. These were characterized by Estonia as acts of aggression. Looking ahead, at what point can you say that NATO would invoke its own charter and actually come to the defense of a small country like Estonia in the face of an aggression from Russia?
Every situation is unique, and of course a country has to ask for the support of the NATO alliance to invoke the Article 5. But I think the existence of hybrid threats, that we can see cyber attacks, that we can see the combination of military and non-military means to try to undermine or to intimidate or attack a country, just underlines the importance of what we are doing, and that is to increase the readiness and preparedness of our forces, so we are sure that we can have the right forces in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, but the point is, NATO would not go to war with Russia over a cyber attack launched on Estonia, would it?
Well, we have decided now that a cyber attack can trigger a collective response, or Article 5. Also
really? A cyber attack launched from Moscow could, you're saying, lead to all-out war between NATO forces and Russia?
We have stated at our summit last fall that also cyber attack can trigger Article 5. Of course, it very much depends on in what circumstances, what kind of attack. But cyber attacks can be very serious. It can be devastating for infrastructure. It can be very, very harmful for our armed forces. And therefore, we are also very much focused on how can we protect our own networks, our own ways of communications, and also how can we help allies to protect their systems, because this is critical for the total defense of our allied countries.
A final thought. Not so long ago on this program, I spoke to Robert Gates, the former US Defense Secretary, and he said, in all honesty, 10 years down the track, he wasn't sure that NATO would still be an effective military force. You're relatively new here at NATO headquarters as Secretary General. Are you absolutely confident that in 10 years' time, NATO will be an effective military force?
Yes, and I'm confident partly because I see a strong need for a strong NATO also in the future to meet all the uncertainties and all the challenges we will also face in 10 years. But second, because I've seen a very adaptive NATO. Also, NATO has been very impressive when it comes to adapting to a new security environment. And just since last fall, we have seen that we have really been able to increase the readiness, the preparedness of our forces, and to adapt to a completely different security environment. So as long as we're able to adapt, then we will also have an important role to play in the future.
Jens Stoltenberg, we have to end there, but thank you for being on Hardtalk.
Thank you.
That was an edition of Hardtalk presented by me, Stephen Sacker. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.